All right, so we're going to talk now about what some people call American imperialism. Now, some people would take issue with that term and may look at this period of time in the late 1800s as kind of a new foreign policy paradigm. And you'll see this term a lot. People love to use that term, and it's kind of almost getting overused now. But when you say paradigm, of course, you mean just kind of the way you're viewing a particular subject. Now, when you talk about imperialism, what do people mean? They mean that, well, you have a country here. Let's say, for example, in my American History 1 class, I'm moving towards the American Revolution right now. And when I talk about Great Britain and the British Empire, you're looking at Great Britain as the mother country, and of course, they have colonies around the world. In the case of the American Revolution, obviously in America. And so when we talk about the late 1800s and people talk about American imperialism, that basically means the United States, moving beyond its borders to influence and control areas around the world. Okay, some people argue, there's a big spectrum here. Big even, and it's kind of to some extent political, kind of like the far left and the far right. And the left, believe that the leftist historians believe that America was imperialistic from the very beginning. People on the right, may reject this notion that America was ever really imperialistic in kind of the classic sense that we see with Great Britain, and that, of course, that Americans should extend their influence around the world. Now, it gets kind of tricky because a lot, we tend to create these binaries where everything's either left or right, where everything's either liberal or conservative. Um, but that's not necessarily the way things are. Even, excuse me, I'm sorry. Even in this case, you have situations, periods in history in which people that were more on the left, let's say Woodrow Wilson, for example, believed that America needed to spread democracy around the world, just like you had people like on the right, like George W. Bush, who felt that we needed to spread democracy around the world. So even this, it gets much more confusing or complicated than that. So kind of what I want you to understand is two things here. Number one is that historians disagree on how to view this period of history, and we're talking about the late 1800s foreign policy. Sometimes I start talking about stuff and I just assume you know what I'm talking about, which, because I have it in my mind what I want to talk about, but you're sitting there trying to get things done, and you're like, what the heck's he talking about? So, just send me an email if that's the case. Um, so the second thing that I want you to understand about, is really what historians disagree on. And again, it has to do with this, all right? The foreign policy, late 1800s U.S. foreign policy. And what most, history books, what you'll find is that they kind of view America at this time as beginning its empire stage, is beginning a foreign policy that is based on imperialism. It's not quite manifest destiny. Manifest destiny was this idea that, well, it was God, it was Americans' destiny to control all of the land from the Atlantic um, to the Pacific. Okay. Well, now we're going to go beyond the Atlantic and beyond the Pacific. Okay. To try to control either islands or areas, or to extend our influence, or America's influence. And again, historians, I mean, when I was at UL working on my master's degree in history, there were two historians there. I'm not going to give you their names, but they would disagree. I used to start trouble with them. I'd get them in the office, and get them started, and it's almost like they hated each other, or something. I mean, it was kind of ridiculous, but they disagreed on, how to kind of view this period of history and American foreign policy and all of that. So just like a lot of debates, I mean, you could, find the truth somewhere in the middle. I mean, they both had very, very good points, and really just depending on how you looked at it, would decide, who you would agree with. I mean, they were both, really, really sharp guys, though. I mean, really, really smart. Anyway, but nonetheless, regardless of the disagreements, there's no doubt that there certainly was a paradigm shift. There certainly was a difference in the late 1800s with the way America was going to started conducting its foreign policy. And again, that had to do with going beyond, getting much more involved around the world. Really kind of becoming more and more of an international power, although we were not a superpower. Now, why? Why was this the case? Well, there were some developments that were perceived as threats to American prosperity and American security. In the late 1800s, a um, naval historian, actually someone that was in the Navy, taught at Annapolis, a guy by the name of Alfred T. Mahan. And he wrote a book called The Influence of Sea Power upon History. Man, I'm sneezing and coughing. I hope I'm not getting sick here. All right. The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. He wrote this in, I think it was 1890. I'm pretty sure. I'm not sure if that's when he wrote it or when it was published, but that gives you an idea. And so basically, he proposed several things. He argued that throughout history, and this is, I mean, y'all didn't have to take this class to know this, but throughout history, those nations which had been economically and militarily successful had controlled the seas. So basically, navy or naval power equaled, you could say, political and economic power. And so he proposed several things. Number one, he proposed the construction of a steel navy. And we're talking, that's for the United States. The United States had like those old wooden ships left over from the U.S. Civil War. A steel navy large enough to oppose any fleet that might be sent against the United States. Okay. Number two, the acquisition of all major islands within 3,000 miles. Okay. The acquisition of all major islands within 3,000 miles of the United States. Okay. Number three, the construction of a canal in Central America. And of course, that came to pass with the Panama Canal. Now, why? Okay, so the Navy, that's easy to figure out. Why did he want this, or why did he propose this, or argue that the United States or advise the United States to do this? Well, of course, well, I say, of course, let's say in the Pacific Ocean, you have the Pacific Ocean, you have the United States, and you have Asia. Now, the Pacific Ocean is huge, and I've flown over the Pacific Ocean 3 times, and it always takes forever. I went actually to Japan once, and I saw a guy get drunk 3 times on the way over there. And you can look at much of American history and U.S. history and argue that a catalyst for much of for a lot of policies, even before the United States was the United States, all right, was Asia. Okay, I probably didn't say that right. Let me put it this way. Let's just kind of go throughout history. What did Columbus want? He was trying to get to a shorter route to Asia. Okay, um, a shorter trade route. Okay, so it has to do with economics, right? If we look at many of the explorers, they were looking, you probably heard of this, they were looking for the Northwest Passage or some passage to get to the Pacific Ocean once it was discovered that this was a continent. All right, so therefore, they were trying to get to the Pacific Ocean to get to Asia. Um, we look at Thomas Jefferson. All right, when he sent Lewis and Clark out on their, um, to explore um, the West once the Louisiana Purchase was um, occurred. They were also looking for some type of river or passage to the Pacific. All right, and so Asia. I mean, even recently, the administration um, stated that we're going to start focusing a lot on Asia in terms of our military. So Asia is always there. Why Asia always has this sort of potential power is because it has a lot of people. Wherever there's a lot of people, all right, there's potential markets, and that's something that's obviously very important. So anytime, like even here, when what Mahan was talking about was trying to find or acquire islands so that they could be coaling stations. All right, so there's coaling stations. You know, here's the Pacific Ocean, and our ships could stop along the way and sort of almost like little gas stations. Okay. Now, the reason, of course, that he wanted an isthmus, or a canal in Central America, again, was because if you're leaving New York, shoot, even if you're leaving New Orleans, you don't want to go all the way around south of South America. You want to be able to go through Central America, and of course, we still have a lot of influence in Panama. I don't know. I went to Panama once, and the currency they use is the U.S. dollar. Okay, and we kind of want to keep it that way. So it's still very important. Well, this kind of encouraged many policymakers to say, look, we need to build our Navy up, and we need to figure out ways to get coaling stations in the Pacific. In order to do these things, all right, the U.S., the United States, had to become a little, one could argue, if not imperialistic, at least much more involved with the world, okay, with what was going on. Now, another thing is that there was a historian who wrote a paper in 1893 called "The Significance of the Frontier on American history. All right. Or I should say in American history. The significance of the frontier in American history. This was Frederick, whoops, Jackson Turner. This is known as the Turner thesis. The Turner thesis. And what he said was that what made America, what made America, what gave America its cultural traits, and how it would, what would you, what were our American cultural traits? All right, individualism, optimism, democratic ideas or sensibilities, toughness, pragmatism. Okay, I'm sure some of you, might be majoring in process technology or something like that, and you're like, what the hell am I taking American history for? That's because you're very pragmatic. I mean, I understand that sentiment. Americans tend to be very like, hey, let's just whatever I'm going to do, I want it to be practical. Well, what Frederick Jackson Turner said was that the frontier experience gave Americans this sort of these collective cultural traits. All right, that when you're out on the frontier, you have to be individualistic. Okay, it was people that came over in the first place that was very optimistic and felt that there would be a better life here. Democratic ideas. The frontier helps in these democratic ideas, or in this idea that everyone is equal, because when you're out on the frontier, everybody does the same work. It was out west that women first got the right to vote because they were doing some of the same work as men and looked upon as more as equal. I'm not saying, that America has always lived up to these ideas, but one could argue at least the ideas are there, even though we haven't always lived up to those ideas. Toughness, all right? People like Theodore Roosevelt. I mean, this is a guy. I think I told you that in the last, in one of the lectures, that once he was actually shot, all right, and was bleeding, and still gave an hour-long uh, speech after he was shot, and then he went to the hospital. Okay, he was, like I may have mentioned that. I mean, they don't make men like that anymore. I'm one of the last ones probably. All right. And like I said, pragmatism. If you're out on the frontier, you have to be practical. Okay. And so this is what Frederick Jackson Turner said. So what Turner said was that there was no longer really a frontier in America anymore. And so people kind of freaked out. And so what some people and policymakers and people in Washington started saying is that we have to make new frontiers. We have to go beyond our borders and create a new frontier for America. And so that kind of encouraged, some people argue, this sort of new U.S. foreign policy in which we would be much more engaged in the world, and maybe to some extent even, what some historians argue, we start moving into what they call them sort of the empire stage of one's development. Okay, but again, that's just kind of one way of viewing it. All right, okay. If y'all have any questions, y'all let me know.